You're watching Badass Lady Folk. I'm your host, Christine Stoddard, and this episode I'm so excited to welcome Bridget Randolph. Hey,
Hello.
how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So you are an actor and a writer. You lived in London. You live in New York City. Pretty thrilling. How did you get to London and how did you get here?
So I grew up in a small town in Northern Virginia, and we lived there my whole sort of childhood through high school and even college. I was homeschooled, and then I went to a local college that was sort of founded by people in the same community. And it only had 6 majors, and one of them was history, so that's what I majored in. And when I graduated, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. I'd always loved acting and writing, but that didn't feel like a practical choice. And so I went with the very practical option of a PhD in history. Was my original thought. And so I applied to a bunch of schools, and I got accepted to Oxford's master's program for their British history program. And so that was sort of my first time really moving out of the house and living on my own. Was going 3,000 miles to the UK to do a master's program. And I didn't realize that was weird until other people sort of said that to me. They were like, weren't you scared? I was like, I just thought it was a cool thing. So I spent 2 years in Oxford. I ended up actually changing my focus from history to anthropology, which was a major I didn't know existed till I got there. Because I'm just really interested in people. And so I was dating an archaeologist at the time.
Whoa.
And he said to me, you never talk to me about your history research, just other things that feel more like anthropology to me. And I was like, tell me more. So I switched over to that. And when it came time to move on for the PhD, my advisor said, it feels like you don't have a really specific thing you really are passionate about that you want to research. So because of the way academia is, I don't recommend you do it just for the sake of doing something.
Right. It's too grueling for that.
Yeah, it's not well paid. Spoiler. It's all about being able to get funding and being really enthused about spending your time in the library, chasing down those sort of obscure rabbit holes. So for me, even the thesis part of the master's program was a lot of that. That was a lot for me. But I was researching film tourism for my master's thesis, and part of that was a lot of marketing surveys from tourism boards. And that got me interested in the sort of intersection of anthropology and marketing and how understanding people and how they work, which is what anthropology is, was something maybe I could use to help people. Initially, I wanted to help my friends that had artistic organizations. I had a friend with an opera company that did great shows and nobody came.
Oh.
I thought, well, maybe I could get into sort of arts marketing. But in the end, I found myself doing online marketing and search engine optimization. And through that, I got a job after school in London. So that's how I ended up living there for another 4 years.
And doing Shakespeare.
Yes, the bug never left, the acting bug. So I was feeling the lack of the creative outlet as I was sort of slogging away at my marketing job. And this is back when Facebook had sidebar ads. Do you remember?
Yes.
There was just this little sidebar ad for a Shakespeare class. And I clicked on it, and it was happening Wednesday afternoon, so I had to get my boss's permission to take the afternoons off on Wednesdays and work a little later the other days so I could do this class. But it was really unique. It was with this company, the Salon Collective, and it was about using Meisner, which is a sort of acting technique that's all about being really present with your partner in the moment, and applying that to Shakespeare. And as part of the program, we performed an original play that was constructed out of Shakespearean text. So the teacher had taken bits and pieces from all these different plays and sort of brought them together into a new story. And once I sort of got a taste of that, growing up, I had loved Shakespeare, but I'd only really read it. There were certain of the characters I really identified with. Being religiously minded, Isabella from Measure for Measure was like a favorite of mine when I was about 12. I really understood her point of view. But it sort of unlocked performing Shakespeare in a way that I hadn't really gotten to before. And that same teacher herself sort of was on a research journey around what's called original practice or cue script Shakespeare performance, which has to do with the theory being this is how it used to be performed back when it was Shakespeare's company doing it, because of the limitations of not having access to be able to print out lots of scripts.
Right.
They would just write it out by hand and have sort of the main script, and then actors would get given their parts and just their cue lines. And that's what they would have to work with. And they had much shorter rehearsal process as well. And so basically the premise is you learn your own lines, you learn the cues, you may have some rehearsal around things that are dangerous, like fights, and other things like intimacy or coordination of props and that sort of thing. And then you just get up and perform it without a group rehearsal.
Keeps it fresh.
So, yeah, I got to work with her over time developing that practice while I was still living in London. And then in 2016, I started feeling more homesick for the U.S., and I ended up transferring to the New York office of my company. I also wanted to explore more acting opportunities because I couldn't work as an actor in London. At the time, my visa was tied to my day job. So I wanted to come to the sort of epicenter of theater and see what I could do here. Interestingly, once I got here, I found myself doing improv classes at the Magnet Theater, which in a weird way is similar to the cue script Shakespeare.
Yeah, sounds like
in many
it.
more ways than people would think. So, yeah, that's kind of what brought me to New York as well.
Yeah, and how have you been keeping active and really still involved in this dream of acting and writing and telling stories?
Well, I kind of took a break from it for a few years. So I came back in 2016. I got to do some great shows with some people, sort of another Shakespeare company I really love to work with called Classics on the Rocks, which I met through a cue script workshop they were running. I've done a few shows with them, and I got a little bit more involved with some new writing places, and of course with the Magnet. But then in about like 2018, 2019, I was feeling very overwhelmed by the city. And I had family out in Seattle who I'd been to visit. It was so spacious. It was so beautiful. It was so nature. So I decided I needed a break, and I moved out there. And then, of course, 2020 came, and I ended up sort of staying out west through 2022. And during that time, though, I got to start working again with the same Shakespeare company from London because obviously when everything locked down in 2020, they took their work online. And because of the nature of the work, it's so sort of solo in the prep. It didn't require me to be in the same place as anybody else or to even be able to meet on the same time zone except for the show. So I actually started doing more of that again, and it helped me fall back in love with acting again because I had started to just be a little weighed down by the slog and sort of taking that space and then getting to re-engage with it through these Zoom performances that we were doing once a month and still are doing. We're doing one in November.
Yay!
Yeah, I'm doing Henry V soon. But it sort of gave me more community. But it also really improved my technique and my work, not just for Shakespeare, but for acting and performing in general, because there's so much autonomy in it and so much, in some ways, that mimics almost an audition. Because you are given this text, you have to work out what you're doing with it. You have to bring in a character. You have to bring any sort of costume or prop or anything like that that you want to use, and then be present with the energy in the space. And so what's been really cool since I've been back, I moved back here at the beginning of 2022, I think, or 2023, beginning of, about 2 years ago. And before I left, I'd had so much nerves around auditioning, and it really held me back from kind of doing the work I wanted to do, because I would get in the room and my voice would shake and I would be tense and not really be able to show what I could do. And since then, it's just really unlocked a different part of my creativity, I think.
I really appreciate what you were saying about community early on in this comment, and also autonomy just now. And before we recorded this episode and we were just chatting a little bit, you were telling me about a storytelling class that you took that changed your life. And I think our viewers would appreciate hearing about that.
Sure. So I, as part of the classes at the Magnet that I was taking, I've also, like I mentioned before, been really interested in writing. So Adam Wade, who's pretty well known in the storytelling world, he teaches a lot of those classes at the Magnet. And I signed up for his first beginner class, and that was great. And so I went to a more advanced level. And while I was taking this class, this was back in 2017, I think, or actually a little before the class started, my family, we lost my little sister. She took her own life for a whole variety of reasons, and in a way, we don't know what the reason is. You never do.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And that in itself is something that's hard to talk about in a way, not so much at this point, 7 years later, because of the freshness of it, but even just people don't know how to respond.
Yeah.
And so, but especially back at the time it happened, I really just didn't want to talk about it with anyone. I was very almost frustrated when people wanted to kind of make a fuss about it, or kind of, in the immediate aftermath of anything like that. I think you feel like you end up comforting other people because they don't know what to do. And so my initial tactic in processing this was just to not mention it and not engage with people who wanted to talk about it. And that didn't work very well. I think it was, something I needed to do at the time, but then I started to realize, no, I need to be able to talk about this. But I was still pretty early in that timeline. And I was taking the storytelling class, and we got a prompt one day, because the way the class worked is Adam would give us a few prompts, and we would have a few minutes to write a story based on the prompt, and then you'd get up and share, and the next person, and so forth. And he gave us a prompt about my first car, and everyone kind of did those stories. And then the second prompt was a moment I'd like to go back to. And I think he had expected it to be sort of light. But what actually happened was each person got up and told stories about grief. It was a woman who lost her first husband young, and a woman who just different, they lost their parent or things like that, and sort of wanting to go back to a moment in time where that person was still here, and you could change something about what had happened, or just spend more time with them. And that in itself was very moving. But then someone got up, and he was on paper very different from me. He was like a gay man from Ireland. Like, I didn't expect our stories to be similar, but and I wasn't planning to talk about my sister in this exercise, but he started sharing a story about his brother, and he got to a certain point in the story where he said how he was he'd gone back to college, and then he got a phone call from his dad, and before he even said what it was, I knew it was the same thing that had happened to me. I could hear it. I just knew. I was like, this is my story. I got that phone call. And sure enough, the details were a little different, but he'd lost his brother similarly. And something in that story just inspired me to want to, let him know it wasn't just him. And so when it was my turn, I was like, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I need you to know, me too. And it was very cathartic for me and for him and for everyone. And I was so struck by the fact that, in this little class of 14 students, at least 2 of us had that story.
Yeah.
Because I think especially with suicide, it's such a taboo topic. And everyone feels like nobody else would ever understand, and nobody else has this experience. And no one's going to know what to do with it if I tell them. They're going to just be awkward. It's going to change how they see me as, potentially. I think that's true of any sort of trauma story, is that we're afraid to tell people because we think even if their intention is great, they're just going to engage with us differently. But that really taught me how vital it is and how healing it is to hear somebody tell a story that about something that happened to you or about your experience in some other way. And so with my writing in particular, that's really sort of my inspiration a lot of the times, is sort of wanting to talk about things, the stories of people that I know or my own experience, in ways that they don't often get seen in sort of our mainstream media. And, the projects I'm working on right now, each in their own way, are sort of exploring, these topics of what do we consider worth giving our life for one thing, especially when that's not something. Going back to Measure for Measure when I was 12, I really got Isabella saying I'd rather die than sin. And those are stories that now we don't find so relatable, but what's our version of that? So that's a thing that I'm really interested in exploring at the moment in the writing that I'm doing, is kind of different lenses on what is it that inspires people to want to give up their life for something, and is that always the most difficult choice, when sometimes I think the most difficult thing is saying, ooh, it's really hard to be here right now.
Right.
It's really hard to stay in the room when I have to watch you go through something and I love you, or when it means I have to engage with nuance and complexity instead of kind of being able to go, well, I'm sacrificing everything for this ideology that's very black and white. To be able to say, actually, I'm going to let it be uncomfortable for a while, sometimes I think is harder. So that's the thread, I think, right now that I'm really interested in. Yeah.
And on a related note, you got very involved with the unbanning of books in your hometown. So could you talk about those efforts?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, the community I grew up in, which is not actually a very large percentage of the town or county, but they're a very vocal minority, I guess. They're a very conservative Catholic community. Majority of them, I would say, homeschool their children because they don't trust school system. And a small number of them last year jumped on this bandwagon that sort of started with Moms for Liberty and Christopher Rufo and all these people. Like, it's not, you guys, you didn't start it. But they got together and they had an event to fill out all these what are called reconsideration requests for our local public library, not even the school library, because that used to be what it was with school libraries. But this was our public library in Front Royal, Virginia, Samuel's Public Library. I'm shouting them out because they're trying again right now. But
yeah, somebody stop it.
but last year it got really intense because they basically spammed them with like 500 plus forms.
Whoa.
Just like a handful of people filling all these out. And they held like a 4-hour community comment session of them just basically talking about how these books in the library were pornography and they needed to be removed.
Could you give some titles?
Yes, I can. My favorite example is a book called Save the Cat, which is for children. It's a picture book. It's about two dads. That was the issue they took with it. Two dads of a little child who are trying to get ready for bed, and it goes very awry with trying to like do all the tasks. So you would sweep the floor and bathe the baby and feed the cat or whatever. But did I say save the cat? I think I meant bathe the cat. Save the cat. Save the cat is the
the screenwriting book. I was gonna say, and there's a picture book that has the same name. Okay,
sorry, bathe the cat.
Bathe the cat.
I think. Oh gosh,
something about a cat.
I was looking at this book so much last year.
The issue was with two dads.
The issue was that the pictures had the two dads holding hands and looking like they cared about each other and having a child. And
the issue was about love in a family, care in a family,
and it was described in very crude terms that I won't repeat. But when people filled out these forms, that was one of the ones that got mentioned a lot. They had a list, though, that was like provided to them by some sort of organization, because some of the books weren't even in our library. They were just sort of filling them out. A lot of the forms said, "Did you read the book?" And they'd be like, "No, I wouldn't." But they would say like, "I got enough from just the cover," like things like that.
No critical thinking.
But anyway, long story short, the library was actually at risk of closing because they pressured the county government that provided part of the funding to the library to withhold the funds unless the books were removed. It was a total of about 130 books, pretty much all of which dealt with LGBTQ themes, and sometimes even just things about representation and diversity they didn't like. Like, they took issue with having a fat main character in one of them, or with people of color being the heroes of some of these stories and kind of having their lived experience represented. So things like The Hate You Give, I think is the name of that one, or genderqueer is one that gets mentioned a lot in these book bans. And a lot of just like kids' books that dealt with sort of either just had queer characters, like queer parents for the little main character child, or where the little child was experiencing something related to gender identity or queerness, like one where it was a little girl who got a crush on another little girl in school, like kind of thing. But long story short, a lot of the community came together, worked tirelessly. Lots of money was spent by the library to try and resist this. We were lucky that the Board of Trustees was very much opposed to this effort being made, because otherwise they would have just sort of capitulated to it.
You wrote a letter to the local newspaper editor.
Yes, I wrote a letter to the editor that I had also had read at the Board of Supervisors meeting, basically sharing some of my story, including about my sister who, when she was in school, she'd given a little speech at her school about learning and how important it was to her as a child and like a younger teen to be able to bike down to that library and read books, not just about queerness, but about just the world. Like she took out a copy of the Quran and she like was just reading all these different things to expand her worldview that we weren't exposed to in the way we were raised. And she really credited the library with being a safe haven for her and a place that she felt like she could just sort of be and find more groundedness. So it felt important to me to be involved, not only because I care about that, having representation in the library, but also as a way of honoring her and her story. And so that, I would say, was maybe only the second or third time I had spoken about it in public. And it felt really important, and I got messages from people afterwards, not necessarily all of whom were in the same position as her, but who expressed the similar feeling of, I don't feel like I can be who I am in this community. And thank you for sharing your story.
Yeah.
Because this is what this community does, is it forces people to not be safe to share themselves fully.
Yeah, and that's so much of being human. Well, we're almost out of time, but was there anything that you wanted to quickly add?
I guess one thing we didn't talk about is that I also work as a life coach. And I feel like that's also kind of part of the whole thing we're talking about here of like how I just have really come to value the ability to be in a space with someone who's willing to like let me into a little bit of who they are and what's really true for them. I think that's like the most healing thing we can do.
Yeah.
Is just sort of share each other's stories and have it witnessed by someone non-judgmentally. So that's what I try to bring to that work as well.
Thank you, Bridget. That is all the time that we have. You've been watching Badass Lady Folk. I'm your host, Christine Stoddard. Tune in next time. Bye.